Hello, and welcome to Conversational Leadership with Jay Mann. I'm your host, Jay Mann, Superintendent of the Creighton School District. And this morning, we're going to try to braid together two topics related to leadership. One is some challenges that we're working through here in the Creighton School District, and the other is a concept of something called WYSATI. And I'll explain kind of what WYSATI is and how it sort of blends into this challenge that we're dealing with. It's my hope that this is helpful to any leaders out there that may either be dealing with similar situations or just an awareness of WYSATI and how it affects our decision making, but also in particular for our Creighton family here. I'm hoping you'll find it useful. So let me start with WYSATI and just sort of lay the groundwork for it. WYSATI stands for "What you see is all there is." And this is a concept that was developed by psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman. He had a book that was published either in late 2011, early 2012, called Thinking Fast and Thinking Slow. And in this book, he posits this concept that often our processing of information and our decision-making processes are affected by this notion that really our sphere of experience, the things that we know and understand, heavily impact what he calls System 1 thinking. So he talks a lot about System 1 and System 2 thinking. He's very clear that when he calls them this, they're really just labels. They're not actual systems. But fundamentally, what happens in System 1, and this is where this concept of what you see is all there is comes into play, this is sort of our quick judgment thinking, how we come to quick conclusions. And as human beings, we're designed for efficiency. There's a lot of reasons for this. One of them is that when you think about the human body, we consume food that generates the calories. That's the energy that we operate off of. And the organ in the human body that actually consumes the most of that energy is actually our brains. And so we have a lot of mechanisms and systems to try to be able to minimize how hard those brains have to work, because they really are a drain on resources in our bodies. And so we have a lot of habits that we develop. We have behaviors that we develop. We have assumptions that we make. We also come to quick conclusions, not just for energy preservation, but we come to quick conclusions because sometimes we don't have the time to think hard about a decision. Think about something that you do every day, like driving, commuting to work. If someone slams on the brakes in front of you, you don't really have an opportunity to pull out a whiteboard and go through like a deep analysis of how hard should you tap your brakes. You need to react in the moment. When you think, back to times before modern times where perhaps, you might be attacked by an animal or something like that, you need to be able to identify, is this animal dangerous, or is this my new puppy who's coming after me to kind of love on me? And you certainly don't want to counterattack your puppy, but you don't want to be eaten by a wolf either. So our brains really have these techniques that we use in order to make our thinking and our decision making very efficient. When we think about System 1, this is the system that really allows us to come to quick conclusions. And one of the challenges with it, and one of the challenges created with this concept of what you see is all there is, you're working with the limited set of knowledge that you have. There may be exogenous variables. There may be things you don't know about that have an impact on whatever the situation is that you're dealing with. But because those are outside of your sphere of reference, you're not going to include those factors into your decision making. The other effect that comes from this is that you often will have an inappropriate level of confidence related to your decision-making process. You'll look at something and you'll say, oh, this is just this. And you'll think to yourself, wow, that's really good. I figured this out right away. And you have full confidence and full faith in yourself that you have come to an accurate conclusion about what's going on and what you should do, what your reaction should be, how you should behave or how you should respond. And very often that confidence is sort of a false confidence. There really is no legitimacy behind it. And yet we will very often throughout our day, if you pay attention to your thought processes and your thinking, I've been doing this recently, you may be shocked by the number of times that you have full faith and confidence that you've figured something out and you know exactly what to do. But if you were to dig into it, you might find that there's other things that are going on that are outside of your frame of reference that you're using for that decision making that have an impact on that decision. When we talk about system 2 thinking, this is really where we slow thinking down and we dig into things more. One of the things that's really interesting about this concept in Kahneman's work is that as individuals, we're not particularly stellar at telling ourselves it's time to pause and get into sort of this deep system 2 type of thinking. Organizations do it better. And so I found this fascinating, particularly having worked in school districts for the past 25 years or so. I worked in higher ed for a decade before that, municipal government for a decade before that. In and amidst there, had some little bit of time as an entrepreneur. And so what's interesting is when you're in an entrepreneurial role in the business world, often you're making decisions very quickly and the factors around you are changing very fast and you're making quick adjustments. When you're in the government realm, whether that be with a city, whether that be with a higher education institution, many of which are government, some are private, even the private ones move like government ones in a lot of ways. And then particularly in a K-12 organization, decision-making as an organization is often slow. We do things like committee work. We do things like, really processing through things, surveying, getting feedback from families. And a lot of times people become very frustrated with that because they think, well, obviously I know what the answer is. They should just do X. Well, the obviously I know what the answer is, they should just do X is that overconfidence of that system 1 thinking. I've worked with the limited sphere of knowledge I have and come to a quick conclusion. Why can't they come to that quick conclusion? And very often that system 2 thinking actually produces a better result. People who've worked on committees with me over the years know that I use a quote very often that is, none of us is as smart as all of us. And I really truly believe that when we bring groups of people together and we process information together and we try to gather as much information as we can to make decisions and we get different perspectives and point of views, we really do have a tendency to make better decisions. I think in a podcast from a couple years ago, I talked a bit about the wisdom of the crowd. And so I think we get some of that wisdom of the crowd effect, some of that statistical, but some of it, having looked at Kahneman's work is really because that's where that deep system 2 thinking can happen. And we can delve deeper into looking at things. So as we think about this, sort of system 1 versus system 2 thinking, as we think about concepts like WYSATI, one of the things that we have to realize is when we're reacting to things in real time, we're in that system 1 realm. So I mentioned earlier there's a challenge that we've been dealing with here in the Creighton District, and I don't think it's unique to Creighton. In fact, I know it's not unique. You may be seeing it in national news stories where you work and operate, your friends and loved ones and neighbors, but people seem to be very dysregulated. One of the things I'm noticing is, folks are very agitated these days. There's a lot of behaviors that we observe, that are very concerning because people react very strongly to information or stimuli or events that sometimes maybe warrant an extreme reaction, but very often either don't warrant an extreme reaction or they're not really benefiting from that extreme reaction. And so I've really been processing on, what are the psychological underpinnings of this? I understand being dysregulated. I know there's a lot of things going on right now in the world that could cause you to be in a dysregulated state. We all have stress and strain in our lives. Being a parent is a big challenge, right? Because we really want what's best for our kids. Sometimes we struggle to make sure that we have that for them, and that's a lot of pressure. Being an educator is a very high level of stress, right? Because, you may be a teacher in a classroom and you're responsible for 25, 30 kids that you're working with, and you're wanting to do your best for those kids. So we want to make sure we're getting the best outcomes for those students. But there's a lot to do in order to make sure that happens. And we live in a world where you don't just get to focus on the education. There's also a lot of compliance you're dealing with. So you're being pulled in a lot of different directions, which can be very, very stressful, especially when, we're also asking you to implement new systems that we're trying to put into place in order to improve the outcomes for our students. So, regardless of what your role is or who you are, just being a human being in modern society carries a lot of stress and strain. And we have a lot of information coming at us constantly. We live in a world where we are constantly bombarded by information, whether it's via social media, whether it's via the traditional media, whether it's just in our daily interactions and activities. You think about new things that are going on in the world, like our interactions with AI. Information can be produced much more quickly, and our ability to even determine the accuracy of that information has become much more challenged. Some people have talked about current society as sort of the post-truth world. You could watch a video and think it's real, and it's completely made up by AI. So there's a lot of different factors that are really kind of affecting the tension and stress that we feel every day in a very fast-moving, fast-paced society with a lot of challenges in them. And this dovetails with this concept of WYSATI because we're often being bombarded with information, and then we need to react to it. And both those systems that have been developed in our brains for efficiency and this concept of this system one thinking, where we're not only going to come to a very quick conclusion on a limited data set that's not complete, but we're going to do that feeling a very high sense of confidence, can put us into a position where we're reacting to something and we fully expect that what others around us are perceiving as a complete overreaction is the appropriate reaction to the situation. And so that can be very challenging. And it's difficult, as I said earlier, for us as individuals to slow ourselves down and say, wait a minute, before I react to this, should I be taking into consideration other factors, other things that maybe I'm not aware of, or things that aren't within my own sphere of influence or expertise? Should I lean over to a neighbor and say, hey, it felt like this just happened. Do you have this same perception that I have? And so it's definitely a difficult thing to do. And so, we've seen people overreact, misbehave in very extreme levels in situations at after-school events, sporting events. And I totally get it, right? Like, you may be sitting there watching your kid play in a sporting event, and you think, wait a second, they're not getting enough playtime. The coach doesn't have them on the field enough. What's going on? Why is the coach doing this? I've talked to the coach before about my kid's playtime. But you, as a spectator and a parent, don't necessarily know all the factors that coach is dealing with. You also don't know other things about that coach, right? Like, is this their first time coaching this sport? We work in a district where we want to make sure we're creating really positive experiences for our students, and we want them to have access and ability to be in sports. But we don't always necessarily have professional coaches, or there's not necessarily someone who's coached for 20 years that can step into a coaching role. And someone may have stepped into that coaching role because they want to make sure kids have that opportunity, but this is their first time coaching, right? So some of the factors involved in that could be they know something you don't know, or it could be they're working through an experience. You think about referees, right? If you've watched even professional sports, we don't always agree with a referee's call. Even myself, I used to watch a lot of Phoenix Suns basketball, and there were many times when I would go, what is wrong with these referees? How can you not see what actually happened there, right? But we're not there. We're not on the floor. We're not seeing what they're seeing. And keep in mind, they're dealing with WYSATI too, right? They're having to make a snap judgment in the moment about whether someone fouled somebody or not. They can't go, hang on a second, I'm going to take 2 hours to review the tape over and over again and get 7 other opinions. They're just making a decision in the moment. And we as spectators don't have an understanding of, what's their background and experience? What are things they saw that I couldn't see from my vantage point? And as human beings, we just make mistakes. And sometimes it's hard for us to pause and give grace and create opportunity. But knowing now that we have this factor of WYSATI, that very often we're making quick decisions with a flawed information set and we're highly confident that it's right, we really should be pausing, and we definitely should be giving grace to people in the moment. And we should take a moment to check ourselves, to re-regulate. Take a deep breath. If you go through a breathing exercise and you're still feeling rage, then maybe it's time to have a conversation with somebody. But it's certainly not a time to become physically violent, and it's certainly not a time to overreact. We need to take a moment and check our thinking. We need to take a moment and check where we're at physiologically, and make sure that we're making certain that the choices we're making when we react to stimulus are the choices we want to make. I think we kicked this entire podcast off with me talking a little bit about Viktor Frankl and this concept of the only power we have in the world is really in that split second between stimulus and response. And so learning a little bit about WYSATI, I think, was really powerful for me because it helps me understand why often in that split second, we don't make the right choice. We put ourselves in a position where we may be doing and reacting in ways that we wouldn't choose in a quiet and rational moment. And so just putting this out there for you to think about, both in your own life and how you react to things and how you process information, but also beyond that as a leader. And we're all leaders. When you're out there and you're working with people, it's a great opportunity to help them stop and pause and reflect, to help them understand that sometimes when we're making decisions in that system one thinking mode, when we're making decisions based on that flawed set of information and we're having that extremely high level of confidence that we know what the right answer is, what the right solution is, what the right action is, just because we have that confidence doesn't mean that we're right. And so it's really important that we take a moment to pause and reflect and take a deep breath. It's also important for us to realize that while that system 2 mode, that mode that many of us operate in, particularly if you're in the public sector, always feels too slow, always feels like it takes forever, but there really is huge benefit to it. And so it's powerful to be able to embrace that as a leader and be able to leverage it to make certain that the decisions you are making as an organization or as a subgroup within that organization are ultimately stronger, better decisions. Faster isn't always better. There's that traditional triangle. You can have it fast, you can have it good, or you can have it cheap, right? But you can't have all three. You can pick 2 of the 3. And so if you can only pick 2 of the 3, a lot of times, unless you're dealing with an emergency situation, fast is not the factor that you really want to prefer for. And so ultimately, that system 2 thinking helps us make certain that we are making quality decisions and that we're taking the appropriate time to do so. Well, thank you for listening today. I hope this was perhaps helpful. Maybe it'll be something that comes into your daily life and you're able to leverage it to help make sure that you're taking that split second between stimulus and response and using it effectively. Have a great day.